Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to yet another edition of the Lambom Show. Today is Wednesday, August 24th, 2022, and we are on part three of our series on Wednesdays, evaluating, appreciating, and dissecting the newly released US Africa strategy by the Biden administration that came out on the 8th of August. The past 2 weeks, I've had two people on set. Today, I'm very privileged, very honored. Reverend Dr. Angelique graciously made herself available. It's not easy to get her. She's always on the move. And I'll let Reverend Dr. Angelique introduce herself, but both of us are members of the a network here in DC. The advocacy for Africa that we have in DC, ADNA, Advocacy Network for Africa. But she wears a couple of hats. She's going to talk about them, but I think you're going to have an exciting analysis of that strategy from someone who has been on the ground. She has worked on different issues related to Africa and continues to push. So, Reverend Dr. Angeli, welcome and thank you.
Thank you.
So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you are currently engaged in and where you're going to?
Well, Lambert, first, I want to thank you for the invitation. It's a joy to work with you again here in the broadcast world. I was a broadcaster before in my life with television work, so I feel at home. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I used to be with ABC and CBS for a while, so it's good to be here in this way. Um, yeah, so I work with Lambert. That's what's most important in this venue at the ADNA, the Advocacy for Africa network. That's we work together on advocacy relative to Africa and the Pan African agenda. And it's there that I have the great fortune to serve as the convener for the Pan African Working Group. Um, Going back to, well, the 1800s, early 1900s, of how it is people of African descent have found solidarity with our journeys despite the transatlantic slave trade and other approaches to separate African peoples. So we have a Pan African viewpoint on who we are and whose we are. I'm also a minister. I serve, I'm ordained in the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated. That's my national church home. But I also serve just across the river here in Washington, in Alexandria, at Beulah Baptist Church. And I help my father in law's church too, still in Indiana, where I was before I came to DC. You know, technology is very nice. So you can do many things, even though you may be in one place. So we just keep up the faith in the faith community, and I'm also involved globally, and that is with Bread for the World. Bread for the World is a faith-based organization seeking to end hunger and poverty. We're people of faith who believe this does not have to be our plight. This does not have to be the reality. And we need policies and structures and practices that live out the vision of what we believe God has for all of God's children. And I have the great fortune of serving as their senior associate and strategist for Pan African and Orthodox faith engagement. So I'm one of those privileged persons who gets to have this kind of full time attention relative to the importance of this advocacy agenda with Bread for the World. They welcomed me in 2014, and we've been trying ever since to lift up that banner and that lens, also a gender lens, to what it is that we do relative to ending hunger and poverty as a woman of faith. One of the pieces that's important in this moment for me is I'm on the way to the World Assembly of the World Council of Churches, which will be also in Germany. Many of our members at Bread for the World are members of also a World Council of Churches. And that includes my national church, the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, which I might add was one of the founding members of the World Council of Churches. And it was people like Benjamin E. Mays, like Pharrell from Morehouse, who I actually succeed. in my role there at the World Council of Churches, having served on the Central Committee. He was there at the very beginning of the World Council of Churches. He was a Pan-Africanist at the early parts of the 1900s. He had the first global conversation on race ecumenically with the churches in 1939. And so he, like Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois and Nkrumah, I mean, all these folks were kind of together at the first part of the last century. And so I am deeply and profoundly honored to follow in the footsteps of these great ones who had the vision to be a part of these larger ecumenical and Pan-African conversations. I had a father who nurtured me in this way of thinking, who was at Central State University, which is a historic Black college, and
Hmm.
Wilberforce, and at Cedarville Bible College. Imagine that. Both extremes, a conservative white school and a very progressive HBCU. And I'm a blend of that too, as you can imagine. But early on, as a child in his library, was studying people like, you guessed it, yeah, Lerone Bennett, and Before the Mayflower, and, reading King, and, and all those things as a young girl under the tutelage, really primarily of my father. So I've never known any other way to be. So anyway, that's kind of a little background about who I am and whose I am, a woman of faith, but who has a Pan African identity.
Wow, that's a lot, and I think we're going to benefit from those different hats. And I just want to kick off with the last 2 weeks. I think something that has come up from the strategy itself has been the fact that it referred to Africa as, I mean, it's dealing with sub-Saharan Africa, and I want us to kick off from that because in the conversation this morning at the CSIS, that's one thing that came out very strongly. The fact that the strategy seems to look at Africa again within a colonial lens. And I'm wondering, from a Pan-Africanist standpoint, what is your evaluation of the strategy in general, and what are some of the things you think worked well? The strategy itself, and what should we be picking out from there?
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be a part of that conversation, so I had a conflict. However, I do have the document, of course. And of course, working with Adna, of course, we are building out our preparations for the African Leaders Summit based on some of the principles and the policies laid out in the Biden-Harris document. I'm sure that you've already discussed the kind of the four pillars that are in the document: fostering openness and open societies, delivering democratic and security dividends, advancing pandemic recovery and economic opportunity, support conservation, climate adaptation, and a just energy transition. I think that there is some progress with the Biden-Harris proposal for sub-Saharan Africa, but I also think, that being said, for those of us who understand our history and understand our identity as Pan-African peoples, we know that it doesn't go far enough. It does move the dime a bit. I do think that it is helpful. And I think it does open up some new opportunities for us to deepen and to move forward with going forward. So, yes, I can see the criticism about it, because those of us who know the urgency of all of those issues know the importance of investment. That's what policy is and what is necessary. What we know about the historic inequities relative to all of those issues that contribute to the issues that are in the document, we know that there's just much more to do. Today, for example, we saw another step in the direction, that is the 550 million that's been allocated now from the Agriculture Department. Secretary Vilsack has just come out announcing that there will be 550 million coming from the benefit of the recent policy package on the Recovery Act, and also the inflation policy that was just adopted and signed by the president. So out of those funds, there will be monies that will be used around land inequities, that will be used around technology and technical assistance. It will be used for, quote, what is being called next gen, to invest in the preparation through HBCUs for young people to have more access to resources to lead in the areas of agriculture and innovation. At Bread for the World, we are advancing the Feed the Future Act, which came under the Obama administration. It's time for its reauthorization in this moment. Fortunately, the Feed the Future policy has adopted 20 African countries, unlike the previous number that was less than that. That the Feed the Future program and the Feed the Future program, Global Food Security Act, it really is seeking to invest in local indigenous leadership relative to food security. But 20 countries is still not enough when we know how many African countries there are. And we know the importance of local and indigenous leadership being able to provide for themselves and coming alongside of what local indigenous people can do for themselves and to reduce imports and other kinds of means that oftentimes hinder what local indigenous leaders can do if we were able to work together in a better partnership. So we at Bread for the World in the process of advancing that. I didn't see a lot mentioned in the Biden-Harris document around Feed the Future. I think it's a very important piece to the puzzle. I saw some hints about it when it was talking about climate and those kinds of things. Bread has a new initiative on climate justice, where we are advancing policies relative to the upcoming COP27. And of course, that's item number 4 in the Biden-Harris document. Is climate adaptation, right? It's around adaptability. And that's what our brothers and sisters are doing on the continent, right? Things like agroecology, that is really benefiting from ancient practices that can protect the soil, not using artificial fertilizers and, really not chemicals that are not compatible with what it is Mother Earth already has to offer us. So happily, you have places like Senegal and Mali and other places that are living examples of what it is we need to do around agroecology and how it is we can benefit by treating Mother Earth the way that she deserves to be treated. So that number 4 is urgent for all of us. But of course, the issues around climate justice are absolutely related to the issues around democratic principles and fostering openness, and the other details that are in the document. So those are just some opening statements I would offer initially.
Right. So let's even focus just on the climate justice itself, because I think it was quite interesting listening to one of the panels this morning, referencing it in terms of Africa has been the least contributor to the emission of the gas emissions, isn't it? But yet
Right.
bearing the brunt of this. And the way it was framed is, you want everybody to be at the same pedestal, even though Africa has contributed the least, and yet you're not taking into consideration the current circumstance. That is why I love the term just energy, because justice has to be part of this equation. And I want to tie that to something that you have been working on, reparations, because I think all of them come together in a nice way. But I don't think that the administration is really paying attention to the question of reparations and how to bring about this just energy transition in Africa. What do you think should be added to that conversation?
Yeah, so Bread has a new initiative around climate justice, and that's very intentional. I think Bread for the World understands that the leadership has to come from Africa. You're absolutely correct. Africa, Asia, and other so-called communities that are low income countries have disproportionately been feeling the brunt of the privilege, benefits, and the disruptions relative to the use of energy in the so-called West, or in the places that are so-called high income countries, if you will. So absolutely there is a disparity there. I mean, if you look not only to Africa, but if you also look to the Pacific, you have literally islands that have been washed away by climate. And the same is true on the edges around the African continent. You have the coastal areas. You have drought. I mean, part of what's happening in Ethiopia with the conflict there, and also with Sudan, is the issue of climate. I mean, decades ago, when I lived in Sudan, in the desert, in the Sahara, I was living there at a time when nomadic peoples, that's how far out I was in the Sahara, were asking the question, why can't I go back to the places I used to move to in ancient days and even in those more contemporary days? And it was because climate was moving the desert south. And so you had peoples coming in from Chad. You had people, where I was only about 100, 150 miles east, yes, east of Chad. So you had fans from Chad. You had folks coming from the nomadic groupings in the desert, all coming together when Darfur exploded, right? And a lot of people don't even talk about that. And that was back in the 90s, right? So, these are progressions that have been happening for decades, for decades. And so now the United States and other places in the West are coming to grips more so with what is happening in their own countries, never mind what's already been happening for decades in countries that are so-called low income or middle income countries. So when we look at the issues around climate, we also have to look at the experiences of Pan-African peoples in those countries, Asian peoples in those countries, because they've already been adapting, right? That's what climate adaptability is all about. They've already been adapting to this. They've actually shown trends of resilience, right? So when we talk to, which is the initiative we're involved with right now, actually the strategist to put this together is faith leaders in Europe, faith leaders in Africa, and faith leaders in the United States. And we're very clear that the leadership comes out of Africa because Africa has been at the forefront of bearing the brunt for decades on these issues. And so we are coming together to learn from what our African brothers and sisters are saying. How are they adapting? What does agroecology look like? What is it that the countries that are in Europe and, of course, the United States, or if you will, in North America, I would include Canada there as well, need to do to come alongside and be an echo chamber of the learnings and the lessons and, frankly, the policies that they have been advocating already, like the Paris Climate Agreement, which we reneged on when one of our presidents decided not to support it, for example. I mean, they're already light years ahead of us. And this is not what is always shared in these conversations around climate and climate justice. Bread is positioning itself to be in a position of coming alongside. And that, to my mind, is what climate justice looks like. What is it we learn from the resilience of Pan African peoples, particularly on the continent of Africa, who have been at this for centuries and have shown resilience? Now, all the answers are not there, but a lot of the answers are if we're really prepared to take on this battle, because it really is a battle. But that demands resources, it demands investment, it demands new lifestyles we're not going to be comfortable with, right? We've got to figure out a way to do our part. And that's an individual call and that's a collective call. And it has everything to do with the investment of policies and practices.
I like the emphasis you are putting there about leadership coming from Africa, and that's the point that Hudson Cameron this morning really stressed out in terms of the fact that this policy has been designed by Africanists, isn't it? Those
Mhm.
who are here in the United States might be with some input, but it's going to take the Africans themselves to be able to be good partners. And I mean, aside, I just want to put this out as an aside because there is a nuanced, call it maybe even overt kind of tension between African immigrants and African Americans. And maybe people don't see it, but I think that you are here, you're an African American, I'm an African immigrant. I don't see any tension between us, and we are partnering on different things to work. But I think that it's important for us to be able to recognize, even within this little space that we have as within the Black community, we are fragmenting the Black community again further in such a way that it is easy for these people to penetrate, keep us where we are currently, and never let us rise. And I think initiatives like the ones that you are pioneering through Bread, with leadership coming from Africa, are things that need to go beyond, so that even the Africans themselves can take advantage. Because I think part of the problem we African immigrants have is we have too many responsibilities to take care of on the continent. And so while here, no, we don't want to be thinking about policy issues. And so we don't even contribute to them. But I don't know, what is your take on this seeming division, seeming rift between African Americans and African immigrants? I know that's not part of the policy statement.
Well, when I first introduced myself, when you invited me to do so, I mentioned my father, right? And my mother. From day one, I learned directly from my father that anyone that looks like me is my brother or sister. I got that. I mean, I don't know any other way to think. I mean, that's how I was raised. That is an aberration. That's actually exceptional. That doesn't always happen easily with those of us who are children of the enslavement period. And the reason is by design. You hate to say that, but when you look at the colonial era, you look at the horror and the tragedy around enslavement. It initially meant to divide us, right? It took the children from the continent to a place that was totally unknown, stripped us of names, stripped us of identity, and ultimately gave us another way to view ourselves that was fundamentally different to some extent than what were the priorities of our heritage on the continent. Now, we know this is hundreds of years true, and it's hard to face it for many. I don't even like to having to say it, but it is history. This is the reality. So when you take peoples, not a people, there were peoples from all over the continent who were brought here. And you bring them into a situation where the dominant culture does not appreciate Africa. I mean, when you do that to a continent, not even countries, but a continent with countries, and you bring the children. I mean, I am a child, I am a descendant of Africa, right? When you do that and you put people into another context where you're divorced, literally divorced from what you have known, and your children are born, and that is perpetuated, that is continued. So by the time you have children my age, although I'm older now, you've got literally hundreds of years that have institutionalized and codified that privilege and that sense of division. When you look at television as a child and everything is about, the image of, I don't know, you could take Tarzan. You could take Jane. I mean, you can take any of these images. I mean, I remember as a child, people were teaching me Africa is the dark continent. I mean, that's in my lifetime. And you start off and you're looking in the mirror, you're looking at yourself, and you're calling Africa the dark continent. And it's not meant in a positive, because darkness can be beautiful to me, as far as I'm concerned. But when you're referring to it as something other than the light of the West or the light of the North, and you're taught that from kindergarten all the way through college, and you're getting that kind of messaging, when you get into the company of your own brothers and sisters, never mind in your own country, but outside of the United States, in Africa, then it causes fear. It causes division. It causes unfamiliarity. And so this is part of the robbery of the colonial era. We're all children of it. It's racism, but it's bigger than that. We're talking about a system. I mean, Isabel Wilkerson's work on caste is probably closer to the kind of social hierarchy that has been created under a colonial approach to peoples and groups. So it's no wonder that when you come to people who are children of the enslavement period, who are coming with our brothers and sisters who are coming to the United States, there's automatic structural tension. It's not even personal, it's structural. It's set up in such a way that that's the way in which the structures work. I believe that we need to have more parents and more schools telling the truth of the beauty and the promise of nations of Africa and of groups of people of African descent in the United States. I mean, the divide and conquer mentality is also domestic. It's not just in Africa or the diaspora, if we go to Brazil or Latin America or Europe. This whole colonial approach of hierarchy has hurt all of us. And it's broken down identities that do not help us when we all are children of God. So I believe and I'm a woman of faith, I'm unapologetic about that. I do think the principles of inclusion that are taught in scripture, I do think the principles of the Imago Dei, all of us made in the image of God, we need to practice those virtues so we can get beyond what we've been taught and what people have understood. Otherwise, I just really think we're headed for even more trouble. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you are just joining us, welcome to the Lambom Show, and I'm on set with Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, and we are dissecting the newly released U.S. Sub-Saharan Africa strategy by the Biden-Harris administration. Now, there's an initiative you are currently involved with. I think that has to do with people of African heritage. I mean, you can talk more about it related to the UN. And I'm wondering how this new strategy coheres or maybe helps push that agenda forward. Or if not, is it something that the administration needs to pay more attention to in order to make sure that at least where the UN is going to currently with this is something that the administration here should be able to support? What are your thoughts?
Yes, and thank you for the invitation to speak into that. So I don't think this is where I think we have a gap in the policy document. We don't They don't spend enough time on the movement to have a global space where people of Africa and African descent can come together before the global context in the nations to make their voices heard. Yeah. I didn't see the kind of emphasis there I would have liked within the document. There is very good news on that front. Again, I want to go back to the end of the 19th century into the beginnings of the 20th century. From day one, I mean, even let's go back further. From day one, unlike the narrative that people of African descent did not resist their enslavement, that people of African descent were quite content to receive basically crumbs from the master's table. That needs to be held into scrutiny. Now we have the rewriting of the narrative of younger people. And of course, that's a whole lineage of people who've been writing saying that is not the case. People of African descent, there were any number of uprisings on the ships that came across the ocean. Yeah. Our brothers and sisters on the continent were weeping for us. There were those who cared about our departure. When we arrived in the United States, there were insurrections and uprisings. I mean, recently, for example, I was just to give a quick example because it's just so real the way these stories are finally coming into more light. I was just in St. Augustine, Florida, with my family reunion. And while we were there, we visited what used to be called the island of St. Mose. Many people have never heard of St. Mose. But St. Mose was created because people in South Carolina, like north of Florida, decided they were going to leave their enslavement and were going to go to Florida for a better life. And this community of St. Mose was created. Why was it created? Okay, you had the kind of chattel slavery in South Carolina that was really a model of the English, okay? Went south to Florida, and there was another form of enslavement, but it was less punitive. It wasn't chattel slavery. It was really a structure where the Catholic Church and the Spanish created a space where people of African descent could marry, they could read, they could write, and create their own separate community. Now, of course, it's not paradise, it's not ultimate, but it wasn't chattel slavery in South Carolina. And they created their own self sufficient community. Self sufficient. And that was in Florida. Well, my point is here that all the way back, and I mean, we're talking 1700s, 1800s here, okay, when this is happening. My point is here, there has always been a struggle to resist, which is that I would say is ungodly, enslavement. And chattel slavery was one of the worst. You've got slavery in the Bible, you've got a lot of different places. None of it is good, but there are various presentations of it. And chattel slavery was one of the most despicable. So when you see these narratives, you understand why it is now. That's why I'm bringing this up. You now have a permanent forum of people of African descent. Because from day one, there's been resistance, and that there's always been a sense of movement to say people of African descent, people of Africa deserve, by virtue of their humanity, by virtue of their divinity, a space to grow and to prosper. And people have died for that. People have stood up for that. Nameless people have died and stood up, have been martyred because of their faith and because of their identity. And so when I look at something like the Permanent Forum of People of African Descent, I'm looking at history personified. If we look into the modern era and we think about what happened with the scramble for Africa, for example, in the late 1800s, 1884, 83, 85, and we come up to the year 1900, you're having your first Pan-African Congress in London. So, this history I'm talking about brings to bear a moment where people of Africa and African descent show up in London. Like, really? And they're having an intellectual conversation. They're having a conversation of faith, a conversation of social identity. And they are saying we must continue to resist and be resilient. And that's based on our faith and our intelligence and our sense of who our people are. And then you have someone like Marcus Garvey, for real, in 1920, who creates a brilliant statement on human rights. I mean, by the time you get to 1948, when you have the Universal Statement on Human Rights, that document in the UN, what became the UN, you had the League of Nations before you got to the UN. But by the time that's adopted, it's already been like about 25 years since people like Marcus Garvey and others with 25,000. Okay. I mean, this is stunning. Over 25,000 of people of Africa and African descent are gathering in Harlem. Yes, Harlem, to say we have a universal declaration of human rights for Pan-African peoples. And then later, again, that document creates some information for what becomes the Universal Declaration. I mean, these are things that are not taught to our children. I mean, I was one of those exceptional ones that was blessed to read Before the Mayflower when I was like 10. I mean, who does that, right? And in those days, that doesn't happen everywhere. Because at the same time, in particularly the predominantly white schools where I was treated as other, because I was the only person of African descent in the classroom, and I was othered all the time and knew my place, I was getting a fundamentally different message. I mean, and that's just my personal experience. So just to say, if we don't have things to counter the dominant narratives, that doesn't always tell us all of what we all, not just people of African descent in Africa, need to know, all of humanity needs to know, because it's contributed to new possibilities.
Thank you. And again, the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent, that's what it's called. And I'm glad that at least there's that movement is gathering steam. And while the world is still playing catch up, we hope that eventually they will. And I want to shift gears now to something that we have not heard a lot of people talk about in the document, but everybody is celebrating the fact that the population of Africa is growing and is youthful. But many people are forgetting that the population is growing because of our women. And the document itself does not pay, if any, emphasis, at least, on the contribution of women. In your experience working in advocacy and as with drafting some of these documents, what do you think needs to be done in order to put African women at the fore and at the core of development?
Well, thank you for that. In 2015, Bread for the World advanced what is called our Hunger Report, which is a systematic document that looks at, that analyzes a particular issue that needs to be addressed to end hunger and end poverty. In 2015, we had a report on women. A lot of people don't know that if there was more equity for women, we could end hunger and poverty. Like, for real. The data shows if there was more equitable treatment of women and girls, not just women, but women and girls, we could actually end hunger and poverty. And that's what our hunger report showed. So that's how critical this issue around gender is relative to ending hunger, ending poverty, ending conflict, and a lot of the other maladies that we experience in our world today. We absolutely have to bring a gender lens to everything we do. We're talking about half of the population, sometimes more than half of the population. And then unfortunately, a lot of our practices and our customs do not support the full humanity and the full divinity of what women bring. Now, the two presidents, the first woman president in Liberia, and was in a conversation about what she thought was one of the top issues on the continent of Africa for Africa to reach the prosperity that it rightfully deserves. And she cited child marriage. Now, that's really hard. But she said if we could really address that issue where young girls could have more agency and more sense of direction and have the opportunity for more education and more opportunities to be as fully engaged in the public society as well as in their domestic situations, that actually we could actually turn some of the challenges around on Africa to a more prosperous Africa that we're all dreaming of. That's how critical the gender issue is. And it's not just around empathy or sympathy for women. This is really an opportunity for us to live into the things that we are all dreaming of, whether we're of African descent or not, whether we're male or female. All of us are thwarted and hindered when we're not able to affirm the full humanity and divinity of women and girls. This is actually an issue not only of justice, but it is an issue of inclusion, and it's an issue of what I believe God wants for all of God's children. So we need to look at the gender issue not just as, oh, it's women or girls over there, and we need to have this kind of sympathy. No, this is about all of us reaching our full empowerment, all of us doing more nation building that is possible. So, I think we have to shift this lens of how it is we're approaching the issues around gender, and also make sure when we're looking at it, we're not only looking at women, we're looking at girls. I mean, I just dream of a world where more girls, little girls, are able to be educated, are able to help choose their own destinies. And so I just think we have to do a better job.
And I agree with you again. Without the women, I like the way you phrase that. If we had that kind of equity, equality for women and girls, we could end hunger, we could end poverty. That says that's a big statement to make, and I hope that we are looking at it. I know you have to go, but we have a few more minutes. I'll take that before you go. I mean, you are part of ADNA that's preparing for the forthcoming U.S. Africa summit, and I'm wondering, having this document as a tool together with the work that you are doing, what are some of the issues you think going towards the summit we should be looking at?
Well, thank you so much. And I'm so pleased to be working with you and others on preparing for the summit. At ADNA, as you will know, we built out an agenda that really is taking seriously what we would call the urgencies. Climate is an urgency. The pandemic is an urgency. Food insecurity is an urgency. All of these pieces around what is urgent. I mean, Adna is looking at the urgencies, and not only the urgencies, but the opportunities. In the Greek, we say it's that kairos, right? Where do we have, if you will, quote, unquote, a pregnant moment to exercise opportunity? With all the things that we've been discussing, as we think about the kind of history of resilience of people of African descent. And now we have the permanent forum that will launch in December in Geneva, Switzerland, and then have a big launch in New York on next year. I mean, when you look at these kinds of moments and this kind of policy that is coming, we have an opportunity here to be able to advance in some ways that we may not before. I mean, it is helpful that the Biden-Harris administration is investing in this equity commission and this 550 million relative to land, et cetera, that was announced today. It is important to know that there is an affirmation of the African diaspora, whether it's generations before my generation here in the US, or whether it's new immigrant communities that are coming. I mean, that's all very helpful. So when we speak of urgencies, we're also speaking of opportunities. Kairos, that Greek of there's a moment that we could take advantage of, all these different pieces coming together. But of course, there's that second bucket, right, around democracy. Democracy matters. The inclusion of all of the people, and that's in governance, structures, and policies. Adna has said democracy matters. And that's also in the Biden-Harris document. But I think we could have said more from a Pan-African lens around that in the document of the Biden-Harris administration. But for us preparing for the African Leaders Summit, we're saying that's absolutely important. What does that look like? And that's part of the impetus for President Biden to have the meeting. Of course, the third one is economic. Economic accountability through and through. That's the third piece. That's another pillar. I mean, if we were able, and this is where I think Adna is coming out, if we were able to systematically address the issues of democracy, which also includes the gender lens and also includes the lens around children, and we were able to have the economic platform of investment in peoples and in resources, we probably would have less challenge with the issues of the urgencies, right? So we're trying to build out this kind of coherent approach of how we weave together these pieces and say that this moment in December is a moment that is a Kairos moment for us to be speaking together to identify where there are both assets and challenges and to move swiftly to implementation. What does the strategic plan look like in its implementing phases? I mean, that's one of the pieces I'm really looking for from this Biden-Harris document. Where is the work plan? Where is the implementation strategy? We're still waiting for that. I'm hoping that the summit will be an opportunity to do some of that work. I'm hoping the permanent forum, as it launches, will be able to do some of that work. I'm also hoping that ADNA will be able to play its role as well as Bread for the World. And I will say one of the things about Bread for the World again is we're really clear about that value of impact. Where will be the measurable impact? Bread believes in that. And I think all of us need to really think about what are those next steps. That's where we can still make those contributions.
So excellent to hear this. I mean, because again, like this morning, that was one of the key points. Implementation. Where is the work plan? Okay. I mean, what are the next steps? Because the danger with these documents is they are so nice, they sound so good. Some time has been spent, and then they are left on shelves to pick up the proverbial dust. And so, where is the implementation? And this? So, if, I mean, let's take off from there. But I want, before we shift gears to that for the last segment, one thing we have not talked enough about is the pandemic, because that was something that was going to wipe out the continent of Africa. It did not. But at the same time, it decimated the economy of Africa. You now see an incredible link, intrinsic link between health and the economy. And most African economies are currently struggling. And you can also show the link between the economies and that and say, hey, this is it. So what, in your opinion, should be the next steps?
Yes. So on the continent of Africa, we were very disappointed. And it takes persons like my dear sister, Dr. Pauline Regina, who is leading that with the ADNA, to say enough is not enough. It's not, I mean, there was all of this charitable approach to let's get vaccines to Africa, let's do all these things. I mean, that was not able to be fulfilled to the extent we would have liked. And part of the reason are these systemic, historic inequities, right? It makes a difference when people are able to produce their own vaccines, produce their own food, this is a fundamental inequitable challenge that we have, particularly for communities that are on the continent of Africa, Asia, and Pan-African communities in the United States. We have to find ways to come alongside so people can invest in their own agency to do things. And until we deal with those kinds of structural issues, we're always going to bump against these challenges. And we're going to bump up against climate. We're going to bump up against food insecurity. We're going to bump up against these challenges because we haven't really wrestled with what does it take to transform to self-agency and community agency and local leadership. So I would say that with the pandemic, what it exposed were, again, the historic inequities. That's what happened in the United States with Pan-African communities in the United States. People looked at places like, in events like Hurricane Katrina and all these other pop-up moments that exposed the historic inequities. And so this is what we were dealing with the pandemic. It was both a curse, but it also was an opportunity to expose the truths. And those are the issues we must wrestle with. Now, one of the pieces I do want to compliment is that you had people like President Bush who invested in PEPFAR. PEPFAR is still being supported. That was a bipartisan policy that really spoke to the issue of AIDS on the continent. And what it did was it helped to build some of the capacity for Africa to be able to respond in some of the urgencies that came along. You had someone like President Obama from the other side who came along and started things like Feed the Future, but also addressed Ebola. Remember Ebola? I mean, it's not like we haven't been there before. And I think that kind of capacity building, that kind of investment helped even in this COVID moment. But it wasn't enough because the historic inequities are still laid bare. And so I really want to argue for us really pulling back the layers so that we can have real transformation. So once we hit another pandemic, because COVID's not gone. And viruses aren't just going to disappear, and climate isn't going to just disappear. We've got to find ways to be resilient, and we need to find ways to build community because all of us are going to be affected, and in this moment are being dramatically affected.
I love the last point there about all of us because I was going to end up by asking you a question based on something, a document that I just read. I think it was written in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, as to whether the US actually needs an Africa policy and why. I mean, again, isn't it enough just to sit back and do whatever? Why does the US need a US Africa policy?
Well, I would simply say, does the U.S. need a U.S. Europe policy? Does the U.S. need a Latin America policy? Does the U.S. need a North American policy with NAFTA and other policies? So the question is, why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we? But there's a bigger question here too. Um, Africa is the future. Despite all of the pictures around hunger, all of the pictures around conflict, all the negativity that's associated with the motherlands, the world needs Africa. Africa is the potential breadbasket and resources for the world. If we just look at even technology, where do we think that technology comes from these little gadgets called cell phones? Where does it come from? I'll tell you where it comes from. It comes from Central Africa. I'm just simply saying that the future of the world, and scholars have been making this case. This isn't just me talking. All of us need Africa, all the nations of Africa to prosper. This is why I say the we. It is not just because of the natural resources. It is the proper, moral, and right thing to do. It is the divine thing to do. All communities matter. And Africa is included in that number. That is an ethical issue, and it's also a practical issue. And that's why Africa matters. And it matters in terms of this diaspora, its children, wherever we are. And so we are called to do better.
Great words there, and maybe I get the last comments. I mean, one last question, then get your last comment. So, if you were asked to draft this strategy, what would you take out and what would you put in?
Well, it's already been drafted. I still want to talk about the plan. I want to really talk about implementation. That's what I want to do. And I think that in the document as it is, you have some basic outlines, okay? Because the details are not there, yeah? But I do think you have enough space in there to build out more prioritization, to build out more your priority tiers, your secondary tiers, etc. I think there's enough in there for constituents to go in and critique it and to say, as constituents, this is where we see an opportunity. This is where we see an opportunity. This may have been left out a little bit, or it may seem sidetracked to you, but this part really matters. Like the whole African diaspora piece, for example. I mean, I see it in there, but we're not really talking as much about the permanent forum or, the kind of agenda that goes in there. So I think a lot of the pieces are there. Now we need a plan where the constituents buy in or not into the framing and say, let's prioritize here, let's prioritize there. So I'm not overly critical of the document, but I do think that there are some gaps that I've named in this hour.
I want to thank you very much, Reverend Dr. Angelique, and I would like to ask for your closing remarks. Thank you for the session, and I hope before that, Stacy, thank you, Stacy. Africa is the future, yes, yes, and yes. So she was just emphasizing that. Thank you very much. But any closing remarks, any closing statements from you, Reverend Angelique?
Yeah, I would just say and again, I try to be a woman of faith, I would just say, let's take the high road of sanctification, the high road of divinity, and that all of God's children matter as our basic principle. Because there are also ethnic tensions within the Pan African community. I mean, there is conflict, there are challenges, there's more work we can do as Pan African peoples for Pan African peoples, as well as all peoples together. So I would just say, let's encourage everyone to take the high road. Let's take the high road of encouragement. Let's take the high road of trying to find where there's opportunities. Let's name the challenges, but let's not leave challenges as challenges, but let's find opportunities to resolve and address problems. You know, I just think that there's a lot to talk about with the problems. I mean, we've named some of them, but we need some people who are committed to some answers, committed to creativity, committed to innovation, committed to seeing what is impossible to be possible. And that's where faith comes in, that's where motivation comes in, and the motive of kindness and the motive of mercy and the motive of justice. So I would just simply say those values when we're doing this work matter. So I just always like to encourage people in that regard, and to keep being resistant to that which is not good, and to be open to that which is possible.
Thank you very much. On a very, very positive and optimistic note, creativity, innovation, and inviting all of us to, look for the answers, come up with the answers, and not focus on this on the problems. It has been an enriching hour. Thank you very much, and I wish you a safe trip. See you when you come back. You'll be in
Okay.
our prayers. Bring our regards to the World Council of Churches, and I'm sure you're going to touch on some of these issues there. Thank you, those who have been watching and those who will come after this to watch this. This is the third in a series that we are doing on the new U.S. Sub-Saharan Africa strategy. Next Wednesday, we'll have another panel, 6 p.m., same station. Tune in. And if you have any ideas, you have any contributions, please send them our way. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you, Amber. God bless you.